I was enjoying my morning coffee when the first truck thundered up my driveway. I wasn't even wearing my badge yet, just standing on my porch with my coffee mug in one hand and a half-eaten biscuit in the other. The dump truck drove straight over Rex's water bowl like it was nothing. That bowl had been in the same spot for 15 years, right under the fence post beside the rosebush my late wife planted. The driver didn't even slow down. Gravel spilled out across my dirt road like broken promises. I didn't curse. I didn't shout. I simply put my coffee down, walked back inside, and changed into the very uniform the HOA had just declared war on. When I stepped back outside, 3 more trucks had joined the first one. They kicked up so much dust that the sun almost disappeared behind it. I watched them with the calm eyes of a man who had once cleared a meth den before breakfast. These weren't city vehicles. They were private contractors hired to dump gravel fast and cheap. They were blocking my main access road, the only way in or out of my ranch. This wasn't just disrespect. It was trespassing. It was sabotage. And it was being done with the full approval of an HOA that had no idea who they were messing with. A white SUV pulled up, its windows tinted and its nose too clean for ranch dust. Out stepped a woman I would later know as Karen Thompson, the HOA president. She wore high heels that sank slightly into the gravel she just paid to have dumped. She carried a clipboard in one hand and held her phone to her ear with the other. I heard her barking something about easements and community upgrades into her phone. I walked toward her slowly, hat low, hands empty. Karen didn't even look at me as I approached. She just waved a hand and told me that all non-residents should vacate the area because they were running behind schedule. I almost laughed. Almost. Instead, I calmly asked what legal grounds she had for altering a county-maintained road. She finally glanced at me, lips pursed like she just tasted something sour. She said the HOA had cleared it with county records, and claimed the road had been misclassified for years. She talked fast, using fancy words like infrastructure and public utility realignment, none of which meant a damn thing to the man who signed off on the county's road map. Still, I played dumb, nodding slowly and scratching my chin like a curious neighbor. I asked for a copy of the permit. She handed me a blurry printout with a crooked notary stamp. I folded it neatly and tucked it into my back pocket. By now, the trucks had begun dumping crushed stone directly over my cattle path. My horses were spooked, kicking up dust inside the corral, and the main water trough was already half buried under gravel. Karen waved a contractor forward, instructing him to install a temporary gate over my own fence. One of my ranch hands, Tyler, came jogging over with wide eyes and his phone in hand. I shook my head. Not yet. Let them finish hanging themselves. After the crew left for the day, I grabbed my camera and walked the road. I took photos of everything, the broken water trough, the dead rosebush, the tire tracks through my fencing. I stood still in the exact spot my wife used to sit, taking a picture of the SUV's tread marks just inches from where Rex's water bowl had once rested. Then I walked back inside and made a single phone call, not to a lawyer, not to the mayor, but to dispatch. I asked for a record of all permits filed by the Briar Hills HOA in the last 90 days. The voice on the other end paused, then asked if this was personal. It's ranch business, I replied. A few seconds later, I got confirmation that the request would be fast-tracked. The next morning, I was up before sunrise. I set up 2 trail cameras and installed a body cam on a fence post near the gate. I knew they'd be back. And they were. At exactly 9 a.m., the trucks returned, now with more gravel, more fencing, and a portable toilet strapped to a flatbed like a throne in a twisted parade. Karen didn't get out this time. She sent a contractor to deliver a note. It was a cease and desist order addressed not to me, Wade Carson, but to unknown land squatter. Tyler nearly choked reading it out loud. I just smiled. I took the paper, slid it into the same folder as the fake permit and nodded. Let them keep going. That afternoon, a neighbor dropped by with a pie and a warning. Word was spreading fast. The HOA was planning to rezone my ranch edge for commercial use, claiming it had been an oversight on the original neighborhood map. If they got it passed, they could put a private gate at the entrance and make me file for weekly access. Tyler asked if we should get the county commissioner involved. I answered by showing him the sheriff's badge hanging in the hallway, catching sunlight like a polished secret. I said it wasn't time to flash it yet. The fun part, I added, was letting them dig their own grave first. That night, Karen went live on the HOA Facebook page, bragging about progress on the new utility access lane, and calling it a win for everyone in Briar Hills who believes in structure and safety. She mentioned that the resistance they were getting was from people who don't even live here legally. I recorded every second of it. And still I didn't say a word. But inside the county records office, a red flag was triggered the moment my permit inquiry was processed. Several inconsistencies showed up. Dates didn't match. Names were misspelled. And the notary stamp was linked to a woman who had died 6 years ago. I got the call just after midnight. My contact in records whispered something that made me sit upright in bed. A document trail was being erased in real time. Someone inside was deleting HOA filings. I thanked her, hung up, and leaned back in the dark. They thought I was just a rancher, a man with land and no leverage. But by morning the sheriff was coming. Not in a cruiser, not in uniform. I'd be on horseback, slow and steady, badge tucked in my chest pocket, camera ready, and a plan in motion. Because when someone tries to pave over justice in my county, I don't call for backup. I bury them with their own gravel. Karen Thompson had never been told no, not by her HOA board, not by her husband, and certainly not by the small-town officials she bulldozed with designer smiles and brunch meetings. She wasn't from around here, but she had money, ambition, and a taste for control. When she moved into Briar Hills, she saw more than a neighborhood. She saw a blank canvas. And what better legacy than to reshape it with her name stamped on every upgrade? The road project wasn't just about gravel or access. It was about turning Briar Hills into the premier gated estate of the county. Her estate, one where ranchers, dusty boots, and outdated fences didn't belong. 2 months earlier, she had walked into the HOA meeting wearing a tailored blue suit and carrying a vision board. She showed them a presentation filled with images of elegant stone walls, a private security gate, and a road extension that would curve beautifully right through the edge of my land. She called it the Briar Expansion Initiative, and pitched it as a necessary upgrade to reduce fire hazards and improve emergency access. Most of the board clapped. A few looked uneasy, especially Harold Burns, the treasurer. He pointed out the boundary lines. Karen brushed him off. She claimed the road was on a misclassified service lane, and that she had already spoken to someone at the county about it. Harold didn't believe her. But Karen had anticipated that. She brought in a guest, a contractor from a city firm who explained how rural zoning often contained outdated maps, and that minor encroachments could be corrected post-construction. The room murmured. Karen smiled. She handed out folders, each with a glossy map and a projected rise in property value for every resident. That sealed it. The vote passed 5-1. Harold's was the only no vote. She ignored him completely and scheduled bulldozers for the following month. She wasn't stupid though. She knew she had to move fast. She'd dealt with sheriffs before. Most were slow, predictable, easy to manage with enough paperwork and political pressure. She figured I was just another stubborn local clinging to his land. Maybe I'd bark. Maybe I'd threaten to sue. But in the end I'd fold. They always did. Her lawyer, Brent, assured her the risk was manageable. He forged the notary on the permit file himself, borrowing a stamp from an old friend who worked in real estate. Karen smiled and paid him a bonus. It was all going according to plan. Meanwhile, I sat in the county courthouse, listening quietly to the permit officer explain the history of my road. It had been marked as private ranch access for over 60 years, listed under my family trust. The road did not fall under HOA jurisdiction in any form. When I slid Karen's fake permit across the desk, the clerk paused. She leaned in close and frowned at the stamp. Then she pulled out an archived notary registry and flipped through until she found the name. The woman had passed away 6 years earlier. I didn't say a word. I just nodded and asked for a certified copy of that page. Later that day, Karen stood in her half-built kitchen, barking at a team of interior decorators about tile colors when her phone buzzed. It was a message from Harold. "Are you sure about that permit?" She ignored it. Then came another, "I'm looking into this." This time she responded, "Relax. Everything's under control. Don't make this personal." Harold never replied. Across town, I walked through the rows of storage shelves at the county record office, pulling files on zoning revisions and permit appeals. I wasn't just angry. I was calculating. For someone to even attempt what Karen had done, they would need a blueprint of the county's approval process. Someone had guided her, someone inside. I suspected a clerk, maybe two. I made notes, memorized names, and kept my questions vague. I wore a plain jacket, spoke softly, and thanked everyone politely. No one suspected I was the sheriff. Not yet. That night, Karen met with her inner circle at her favorite wine bar. It was the kind of place where small plates cost more than most people's groceries. She laughed loudly, sipped a red blend, and bragged about shutting down that stubborn rancher. She told them how I had shown up, looking confused, dusty boots and all, trying to act like he had authority. They all laughed. She mocked my flannel shirt, called me Sheriff Hayseed, and said she couldn't wait to see my face when the permanent gate went up. One of her friends filmed the whole rant on their phone, tagging it with a private group caption. The video was meant to be a joke. It wouldn't stay that way for long. The next morning I received an envelope under my door. No return address. Inside was a USB drive. Tyler plugged it into the office computer while I leaned over his shoulder. The video played, Karen laughing, mocking, explaining the forged permit, naming the notary. My jaw clenched but my eyes stayed cold and steady. I told Tyler to make 3 copies, one for the county attorney, one for the state ethics board, and one for backup. That same day, Karen called a meeting with Brent. She was worried about Harold. She'd heard he had been asking questions about the road classification. Brent told her not to panic, that I didn't have jurisdiction, since the project fell under civil development. Karen wasn't convinced. She told Brent to draft a cease and desist for me and label me a squatter, if necessary. Brent hesitated, but the money was good. He agreed. What Karen didn't know was that Harold had already called me. The 2 men met at a diner off the highway. Harold looked nervous. He apologized for not stopping the vote and handed me a folder full of meeting minutes and Karen's original presentation, which clearly showed my ranch being targeted. I thanked him, said it wasn't personal. Harold laughed bitterly and said it felt personal now. His own property was being devalued to create Karen's fake buffer zone. I told him to sit tight and stay quiet. That evening, I sat at my kitchen table, flipping through the HOA's plans again. Karen had overstepped, not just legally but morally. She'd used money, deception, and arrogance to bully her way across my land. I knew her type, entitled, polished, too proud to see their downfall coming. But it was coming. Outside, the gravel trucks had stopped for the day. Silence hung over the ranch like a coiled storm. I stared out the window, my badge resting on the table beside me. Tomorrow I'd wear it. Not because I needed to prove who I was, but because it was time to remind Karen Thompson that this wasn't her county. It was mine. The morning started with the low hum of drones gliding over the pasture, their cameras blinking red as they mapped the damage below. I stood by the gate, arms crossed, watching the sky like a hawk tracking its prey. I had flown recon missions before, back when justice came with camo and silence. Now it came with county permits, dirt trails, and trail cams mounted on fence posts. The same strategy applied. Document everything. Say nothing. Strike when the target is fat, overconfident, and blind to its own exposure. Karen had no idea she was being watched from every angle. Down by the creek, Tyler was running a fence line check and calling out each section that had been damaged by the trucks. A few rails had been snapped clean through. The wire was tangled where the dumper tires had clipped it, and 2 posts were leaning like old teeth knocked loose. The cattle had shifted further uphill, avoiding the mess near the main road. I'd rerouted the water troughs using old irrigation channels to keep them hydrated. It was a temporary fix, but it would hold. That afternoon, a fresh wave of contractors arrived. This time they brought more than gravel. They hauled in heavy steel poles, orange plastic fencing, and a set of portable signs that read Construction Zone and Authorized Personnel Only. Karen did not show up in person. Instead, a clipboard guy named Evan handled the talking. He was younger, smug, and overly eager. He called me partner, and handed me a revised plan that showed a projected road path cutting deeper into the edge of the ranch, slicing through my horse trail and grazing area. I took the papers without saying a word, folded them in half, and slid them into my shirt pocket. Evan didn't like the silence. He tried to make small talk, asking about cattle feed, water rights, and ranch upgrades. I kept my face blank, gave short replies, and eventually walked away without a handshake. Evan watched me go, confused and slightly unnerved. He had no idea the entire interaction had been recorded from 3 angles, including audio. The footage would be added to the growing file labeled Evidence. Later, I walked the southern fence with my camera, snapping photos of every new post the contractors were planting. I made sure to get timestamps, angles, and close-ups of any markers that crossed onto my land. I noticed they had installed a gate post exactly 6 inches inside my boundary. It was a small violation, but significant enough to prove intentional trespass. Just the kind of detail county lawyers like. By sunset, I had over 200 photos, several drone sweeps, and clear footage of workers receiving verbal approval to dig where they had no right to. Meanwhile, Karen sat in her temporary HOA office, sipping sparkling water and reviewing budget sheets. She was already planning a press release about the new road. She wanted aerial shots, testimonials from homeowners, and a soft piano score for the background. She called Brent and asked if they could expedite the easement filings. Brent hesitated. He told her the notary issue was starting to raise questions. Karen snapped at him, told him to fix it, then hung up. She texted Evan and told him to increase pace and get the foundation poured before the county could stall them. She believed momentum was the best shield. If enough money had been spent and enough concrete had been poured, then the county would be forced to let it continue. But she miscalculated. I wasn't trying to stop her. Not yet. I wanted her to keep building, to leave fingerprints on every violation. I wanted her to stack the violations so high they couldn't be dismissed as oversight. That evening I sat down with the file and began labeling each segment. Video clips, drone stills, photographs, audio recordings, and permit inconsistencies. I separated the folder into 2 piles. One was for the county commissioner. The other was for the state attorney's office. Both would be delivered the moment Karen tried to escalate. As darkness fell, Tyler and I sat on the porch eating chili and watching the road. Tyler asked if we should start blocking access points. I shook my head. Let them come. Let them build. The higher they climb, the harder they fall. Tyler chuckled and said he didn't want to be around when the crash came. I told him it was coming soon. The next morning, we discovered that the contractors had installed a new sign at the edge of the property. It read, "Future site of Briar Hills Emergency Lane." I took a photo, then pulled out an old survey map. The sign wasn't just illegal. It was planted squarely in a spot designated for soil conservation, a restricted area protected by state mandate. That was the tipping point. I called in the fine to the county environmental office and submitted the GPS coordinates along with photos and time-stamped video. I didn't mention who I was. I wanted the paperwork to move clean without interference. And it did. 2 days later, a quiet inspection team arrived from the environmental office. They took soil samples, snapped pictures, and asked quiet questions to the contractors. Evan panicked and called Karen, who rushed down in her SUV, heels clicking on the gravel as she demanded answers. The inspector introduced himself, explained the boundaries, and informed her that any further work in the area would be halted pending review. Karen tried to bluff, waiving her permits and citing county cooperation. The inspector politely asked to see them. She handed over a folder, unaware that I had already submitted a report outlining the false notary issue. As Karen argued, I stood behind a tree line watching it all unfold. I wasn't smiling, just focused, calm. I wanted her to feel in control a little longer. The worst kind of fall was the one that came after you thought you'd won. That night, I updated the file again, adding audio from the inspector's visit. I made 3 new copies and sent one to the regional zoning director with a handwritten note attached. The note simply said, "Watch her next move." Karen, unaware that the tide had begun to turn, held another HOA meeting. She spun the inspection as a minor delay caused by bureaucratic red tape. She blamed outdated maps, claimed progress would continue, and promised a new set of permits within the week. She told residents not to worry. Everything is under control. Harold sat in the back, arms folded, saying nothing. He had seen enough. He would no longer defend her when the crash came. Meanwhile, contractors slowed their pace. The whispers were growing. Some knew something was off. Others didn't care as long as they were paid. But they all sensed the job site was getting hot. I let them keep working, knowing each fence post was another nail in Karen's legal coffin. I stood on the porch that evening, the sky orange and cracked with sunset, and watched a dumper truck idle at the road's edge. The driver looked around nervously, then backed off and left without unloading. I sipped my coffee, the badge still tucked in my chest pocket. The plan was almost ready. One more mistake, one more push, and the sheriff would stop watching. He would act. The courtroom wasn't packed, but every person inside sat like they were witnessing a storm rolling in. The fluorescent lights flickered slightly overhead as the county commissioner called the meeting to order. A hearing had been scheduled to address a formal complaint filed against the Briar Hills Homeowners Association for unauthorized construction and land encroachment. The air was dry with tension. Karen Milford walked in with her usual arrogance, heels tapping like gunshots against the tile floor. Her lawyer, Brent, trailed behind, holding a leather briefcase stuffed with half-truths and edited permits. Karen smiled at a few familiar faces in the audience, nodded confidently toward the panel, and took her seat like she was arriving to accept an award. The clerk began reading the complaint. Multiple allegations of illegal dumping, boundary violations, forged permit documentation, and interference with protected land. Karen leaned back in her chair, barely listening, her fingers drumming softly on the table. Brent whispered something about protocol, and she brushed him off. She had faced tougher rooms during board takeovers in the city. These rural officials didn't intimidate her. She was already preparing her closing remarks in her head. Calm, polished, persuasive. She would blame miscommunication, insist on her respect for due process, and promise swift correction. It always worked, until the sheriff stood up. I rose slowly from the fourth row, wearing a brown jacket, clean shirt, and the unmistakable silver star clipped to my chest. Karen blinked, confused for a moment, then quickly recovered and whispered to Brent. I stepped forward when asked if anyone present had relevant testimony. I did not walk to the podium. I walked to the center of the room, turned to the panel, and opened a manila envelope. I held it casually, not with anger, but with the slow certainty of a man laying out a checkmate. Inside were photographs, drone images, video stills, GPS records, time-stamped footage, soil inspection reports, and most damning of all, the original permit Karen had submitted with the notary stamp of a woman who had been dead for 6 years. I did not yell. I did not accuse. I calmly explained what had happened on my land. I detailed the construction activity, the damage to my fence, the interference with livestock, the water troughs that had been buried, and the personal property that had been damaged without any legal right. I explained how the road they were trying to seize had been listed in my family's name for over 60 years and had never once fallen under HOA jurisdiction. I handed each board member a folder containing copies of everything. Karen watched me with wide eyes, suddenly pale, the calm washing from her face like color draining from fabric. She tried to object. Brent stood and said they had not been notified that Sheriff Wade Carson was involved. The commissioner shut them down with a wave. I hadn't needed to notify anyone. I was a private citizen until now. And now I stood as the elected sheriff of the county, formally lodging a violation against the HOA for illegal activity. Karen stood up, voice trembling for the first time. She accused me of abusing my authority, of holding back my identity to trap her, of sabotaging community progress for personal vendetta. Her voice rose in pitch, the mask slipping. She pointed at me and said I had tried to intimidate her from the beginning. I didn't even look at her. I faced the panel and stated one final fact. The sign she had placed claiming construction of an emergency access lane had been placed on state-protected conservation land. That alone, I said, carried a fine of up to $50,000. The panel called a recess. Karen sat down hard, visibly shaken, whispering harshly at Brent, who could no longer meet her eyes. The audience had gone silent. Harold, the HOA treasurer, sat 2 rows behind Karen, arms crossed, face stone still. He had known it was bad. He hadn't known it was this bad. He stood and left the room without saying a word. During the break, reporters outside began picking up whispers. Sheriff versus HOA road war in Briar Hills. A local blogger tweeted a photo of me calmly holding the folder of evidence. The tweet spread like a grass fire. By the time the panel reconvened, the hearing room was full. New attendees had squeezed in. Phones were recording. People weren't whispering anymore. They were listening. The commissioner returned with a short statement. Due to the overwhelming evidence presented, all ongoing construction activities tied to the HOA expansion project were to be immediately halted. All associated permits would be frozen pending full investigation. The county zoning office would conduct a full audit of Briar Hills activities over the past 2 years. Karen opened her mouth to object again, but the commissioner warned her that further disruptions would result in removal. Brent sat slumped, running his fingers over his forehead. The panel further ruled that the HOA would be held financially responsible for any land remediation, damage to private property, and potential environmental penalties. The ruling would be formalized within the next week, but as of that moment, the road was no longer theirs. And neither was the narrative. I stepped outside without waiting for applause. I didn't need it. Tyler was waiting by the truck, leaning against the passenger door with a grin. I nodded and said the groundwork was done. Now it was time for cleanup. Tyler asked if we should start pulling the trail cams. I shook my head. Leave them. There might still be more to catch. Inside the courthouse, Karen refused to leave. She argued with Brent, demanded he call in favors, tried reaching out to local news channels to spin the story. One channel ran her statement unedited. It showed her flustered, defensive, cornered. The comments section lit up with ranch emojis and phrases like, "Don't mess with the sheriff," and "gravel justice." The tide had turned faster than she imagined possible. She had come in with plans to dominate and left as the face of a failed land grab. I returned home to find 3 voice messages waiting. One from the commissioner thanking me for my composure. One from the state attorney's office, requesting a meeting, and one from a stranger who had seen the clip online, offering free legal support in case things got ugly. I didn't return any calls that night. I sat by the fire, boots off, and poured a single drink. I thought about the road, about the broken fence, about the way Karen had looked when she realized who I was. The silence of the ranch settled around me like a familiar blanket. Outside, the trucks were gone. The gravel lay scattered like a monument to arrogance. The air was still. But I knew the storm wasn't over. Karen wasn't the kind to go quietly, and when she came back, I'd be ready. This time with the full weight of the county behind me. Karen's silence didn't last long. Within 48 hours of the hearing, her HOA newsletter went out with a bold headline that read, "Standing Strong Against Rural Bullying." She painted herself as a victim of political targeting, claiming that I had intentionally withheld my identity to manipulate the board and undermine progress. Her statement was carefully worded, backed by vague legal terms and accusations that I had used my badge to settle a personal dispute. It was the kind of tactic that worked well in polished neighborhoods full of people too busy to read past the first paragraph. But this wasn't a polished city district. This was ranch country, and folks here didn't forget what they saw with their own eyes. The newsletter backfired. Residents began calling emergency meetings, demanding to see the full documents and evidence presented at the hearing. Harold, who had stayed mostly quiet, finally stepped forward. He showed them the original maps Karen had used and the internal emails where she pressured the board to vote before any legal confirmation had been received. He even shared a message from Karen threatening to have him removed from the board if he kept raising concerns. The meeting turned ugly. Karen wasn't there. She had scheduled a separate, private event to control the narrative, but the damage was already done. Meanwhile, I was already 3 steps ahead. I had filed formal complaints with the State Ethics Committee, the Environmental Protection Office, and the Regional Land Commission. Each complaint was attached to evidence, each folder meticulously labeled. One of my reports included text messages between Karen and Brent that had been anonymously leaked by a contractor. In them, Karen told Brent to delay responses to county officials, ignore warnings about boundary lines, and focus on getting the road poured before anyone could intervene. She ended one message with, "They'll have to finish it once it's halfway done." That text alone was enough to spark a new round of investigations. Karen tried to push back through media. She hired a PR firm from the city and began releasing a series of polished videos talking about community vision, rural revitalization, and how, sometimes pioneers face resistance. In the first video, she stood in front of a field with construction equipment in the background, speaking like a campaign candidate. What she didn't realize was that the background clearly showed state conservation markers. The internet noticed. A popular social media account reposted the video with side-by-side comparison clips from my evidence file. It went viral within hours under the caption, "She paved over the law." Brent began to panic. His inbox flooded with inquiries, subpoenas, and warning letters from the state bar. He called Karen repeatedly, begging her to slow down. She refused. Instead, she doubled her efforts, holding a press event at the unfinished road site. She wore a high-visibility vest and a hard hat and spoke about perseverance. But as she answered questions, a state officer arrived, quietly walked past the crowd, and handed her a letter. It was a cease and desist order. Construction was to be halted immediately. All equipment was to be removed within 72 hours or be impounded by the county. Karen didn't speak to the press after that. Back at the ranch, Tyler and I were repairing the last section of damaged fencing. The cattle had calmed and the new water line was running steady again. We worked slow and quiet, the way men do when a storm has passed but the air still feels heavy. I got a call from the county attorney, asking if I would be available to testify in a formal hearing. I said yes without hesitation. Then I got a second call. This one was from a man representing several families inside Briar Hills. They were organizing a petition to remove Karen from her position permanently. They asked if I would be willing to speak at a community forum. I agreed again but made one request: no cameras, just people. The forum was held in a large barn just outside the HOA boundary. The crowd was bigger than expected. Families, workers, ranchers, retirees, even a few kids sat on hay bales and folding chairs. I didn't make a speech. I told a story about land, about boundaries, about respect. I talked about how laws weren't just words on paper, but agreements between neighbors. I said, power without humility always turns into destruction. No one clapped, no one shouted, but every head nodded. That was enough. The next day, Karen received official notice from the HOA board. A vote would be held to determine whether she remained president. The letter was cold, formal, and signed by every board member except Harold. His name wasn't needed. His silence spoke louder than signatures. Karen didn't respond. She packed a small bag and left town for a few days, leaving Brent to face the fallout. He received a notice from the state bar informing him that an investigation had been opened into his involvement in the forged notary documents. His license was suspended pending review. Contractors pulled out one by one. Equipment was removed. Fencing was taken down. The unauthorized road was left half completed, a scar across the land that nobody claimed anymore. I made one final visit to the site. I walked its length with a quiet focus, taking notes on erosion, soil damage, and boundary shift. I filed a report with the Environmental Office, asking for support in land restoration. Then I posted a new sign at the entrance: private property, county-monitored access, restricted by order of sheriff. I didn't hold a press conference. I didn't need to. The message was clear. Karen returned to find her house surrounded by silence. No friendly faces, no board allies, just a certified letter waiting on her porch. Inside was the vote count. She had been removed by an overwhelming majority. Her access to board funds, documents, and platforms was revoked. The HOA would be restructured under temporary leadership. She slammed the door and paced her kitchen. The windows opened to a landscape she no longer controlled. That evening I sat on my porch as the sun dipped low. The road was quiet. The cattle were calm. The badge rested beside me again, catching the last light of the day. I sipped coffee and listened to the wind move through the grass. Tyler came by and asked what came next. I said nothing for a long moment, then finally replied that justice is quiet when it's done right. I stood up, stretched my back, and walked toward the barn. Because it wasn't just about fixing what was broken, it was about reminding people that out here respect still mattered. And those who forgot that, no matter how loud they built, always fell the hardest when the hammer dropped. The sky was overcast when the bulldozers came back. Not to build, but to tear everything down. The county had sent a demolition crew with strict orders to remove all unauthorized structures and restore the land to its original condition. I stood at the edge of my ranch road watching them work, arms folded, boots planted steady in the dirt. The same machines that had once churned up my fence line were now reversing every inch of damage under the authority of the same badge I wore. No one cheered. There was no celebration. Only the grind of steel and the crunch of gravel as the so-called emergency access road was erased from the land like a bad memory. Karen did not show up. She had stopped trying to fight once the court injunction hit. Her lawyer, Brent, was now facing disbarment, and the state had frozen her accounts tied to the HOA budget until the investigation was complete. What little public support she had tried to hold onto had dissolved after video footage from the county hearings spread online. A quiet clip of her shouting about being ambushed by a sheriff, while officials calmly presented evidence, had become a meme. It wasn't just embarrassing, it was defining. Her name was no longer associated with leadership. It was associated with overreach and humiliation. Meanwhile, I had shifted my focus to cleanup. I had coordinated with a local environmental group to assist in land restoration. Soil engineers tested for damage where heavy vehicles had compacted the ground, and wildlife experts checked the creek bed for any runoff contamination. I walked every inch of the path they had carved through my land. I carried a worn notebook, jotting down notes, taking reference photos, and making a list of every plant and tree that had been destroyed. Some things could be rebuilt. Some things couldn't. Tyler helped replant fence posts, working silently beside me without asking questions. We moved like clockwork. Two men used to handling messes with our own hands instead of waiting for others to fix them. We didn't talk much about Karen anymore. She had become just another problem that had passed through and gotten handled. Out here there was always another problem. The barn needed repairs. The eastern trough had sprung a leak. A calf had gone missing in the night and needed tracking. Life didn't stop for courtroom drama or social media noise. One morning I got a call from the State Ethics Committee. They informed me that a ruling had been passed. Karen Thompson was found guilty of multiple violations, including unauthorized land alteration, abuse of HOA authority, and conspiracy to falsify legal permits. She would be barred from holding any leadership position tied to public development projects in the state for a minimum of 10 years. Fines were issued, and she was instructed to pay restitution for damages caused to private property and environmental zones. I thanked them for the call and returned to mending a split rail on the north pasture. That afternoon, a local news team arrived. They asked for an interview. I declined. I said the story had already been told. What people needed now wasn't more noise. It was clarity. I gave them permission to film the cleanup, to show how the land was being restored. But I stayed out of the frame. I didn't want to become a face for a story that should have ended with the law doing its job. I hadn't stood up for attention. I had stood up because someone had crossed a line, and where I came from, lines mattered. In Briar Hills, the HOA underwent a complete overhaul. New leadership was installed, and a vote was held to approve a community charter that clearly defined the boundaries of their influence. For the first time, members were invited to participate in zoning discussions and public forums without restriction. Harold was nominated as interim president but declined. He said the role needed someone with fresh energy, someone who could rebuild trust. A woman named Naomi, a school teacher who had lived in the area for a decade, stepped forward. She knocked on every door in the neighborhood, listening before talking. She was elected unanimously. Naomi reached out to me a few weeks later. She requested a meeting, not to apologize but to talk about a shared future. She asked if we could work together to ensure nothing like this happened again. I invited her to the ranch. We sat on the porch under a gray sky and spoke plainly. She asked about the history of the land. I asked about her vision for the neighborhood. We agreed on one thing above all else: respect had to be mutual or it meant nothing. As part of a settlement agreement, Karen's unfinished road site was designated as a public nature easement. I volunteered to help design the trail that would replace the gravel mess she had left behind. With funding from both the county and local donations, the trail would feature native plants, wildlife markers, and small wooden signs explaining the history of the ranchlands. It wasn't about turning my pain into a tourist site. It was about reminding future developers and decision-makers that these lands had a legacy long before HOA meetings and construction permits. Tyler helped build the first bench along the trail, carving the date into the side with a pocket knife. Kids from a nearby school helped plant trees along the path. I taught them how to dig the right way, how to pack the soil, how to treat a seedling like something that mattered. The land had scars, but it also had roots. On the final day of demolition, the last steel beam was pulled from the dirt and loaded onto a flatbed. I watched from the tree line, arms crossed, 1 foot resting on a stone marker that had once served as a fence guide. The crew chief nodded at me as they rolled out. No words were exchanged. They weren't needed. The land was mine again. Not by court ruling or public approval, but by right earned, defended, and restored. That night, I sat by the fire with my boots off and the badge resting on the table beside me. A hawk called in the distance. The wind moved softly through the grass. Tyler sat across from me, sipping from a chipped mug. We didn't talk about what came next. We didn't have to. The road was gone. The damage was being healed, and whatever storm came next, we'd face it the same way we always had, with hands in the dirt and eyes on the horizon. Sometimes justice looked like a courtroom. Sometimes it looked like a bulldozer backing down a stolen road. But most of the time I believed it looked like this: a quiet night, an open sky, and a land that still answered to its owner.